step in our combined climate and energy policy. We start that process now, as we are suggesting. There is a public consultation going on right now. That would mean that in 2014, our companies, our industries, our businesses, our energy planners would know more or less what can they count on for after 2020. In other words, we give them the predictability that is always the first thing that industry would ask for politicians. If we postpone this discussion into a new Commission, a new European Parliament, it could easily become 2017, maybe even 2018, before we will know what our policies after 2020 is. And that is why I thought it was very important now to start this discussion. What should our targets be for 2030? I know that my colleague, Mr. Oettinger, has been here earlier today, and you have heard some of our reflections, but it's clear that in the Commission, we try to think it in an integrated manner, not just climate here and energy dependency here. Actually, when we discussed it in the Commission, and we had a very principled discussion about should we do this, and if, what should the targets be, how many should we have, I presented to my colleagues a graph done by the European Commission services showing the need for investing in energy grids and everything for the next many years. The interesting thing is that when you have two graphs, one shows the cost, what you would have to do even if you were not thinking about climate. And the other shows what you need to do if you also include climate. Then you can see that the costs will be almost identical. Because even if we had no climate change challenge in Europe, we would have to do a lot of investments in energy in the decades to come, to have more efficient systems, more efficient grids, more interconnectors, all this. But it costs only a tiny bit more actually to do it right, seen from a climate perspective. So that's why we think that it makes also economic sense to address climate issues through setting up the targets. It's open still whether we should have not only a CO2 target, but also a renewables target and efficiency targets. I think, and there of course we need the input also from national parliaments in the consultation that is going on. I just think that it's very important to remember that our competitors, they are moving. The Chinese, they have seen that there are a lot of interesting markets for energy efficient, resource efficient products, renewable technologies. They create really many jobs in this area. And I think that when we define what we want to do in Europe, we should also think that one of our very big challenges, that is how to get more innovation in Europe. I believe by setting up targets, binding targets, we can help our governments to stay tuned. We can let our companies know where we are heading, and if we are doing it smartly, we can also create new export products, new solutions that we can prosper from economically. So that's one thing about the targets. We can come back to some of the details. The other thing that we can also do from the European level, that is to take care that the pricing is right, that it costs something to pollute. When Beijing, for instance, 3 months this winter was almost drowning in pollution, so much so that some big international companies started to withdraw personnel because they could not defend to have the families based in Beijing because of the level of pollution. High-ranking Chinese officials said in the press, the pollution in Beijing is not an environment problem. It is a problem illustrating the problems of our economic and political system. Because if you are not factoring in the cost of polluting the common goods, then it's a very short-term thinking. That is what we so far have managed to do in Europe, to put a price on pollution, also on carbon pollution. That is actually what we did with our emissions trading scheme. And without going into a lot of boring details, I would just say this system so far has served us very well. It is a market-based system, and therefore it makes sense when there is a crisis and activity in society goes down, then of course the demand after allowances will go down, and then of course the price should go down. So far, you could say that is the market at work. But the problem is, if the price comes down to almost zero, are we then talking about a price instrument, a key tool that is actually doing its job? If it doesn't make a difference whether you invest in an efficient solution instead of an inefficient solution, do we then have an efficient tool? In the Commission, we thought when you have a market that is already overflooded with something, in this case with allowances to pollute, you should stop continuing overflooding the market. That is normal, that then you stop the overflooding. That's what this backloading proposal that you have heard about, that is what it's about. Don't continue to overflood an already overflooded market. If the European Parliament last month had endorsed this proposal instead of sending it back in the Environment Committee, then according to 4 independent analyses, the prices would have come back to where they were last November. So those who argue against this because they argue that then you would have a steep increase in energy prices, it is simply not right. You would just avoid that it comes so close to zero that you cannot call it a key instrument any longer. I think it's very important in Europe that it costs something to pollute. I think we should protect a system that is market-based, meaning that it's cheaper to get your allowances when there is a crisis than when there is not a crisis, but take care that it does not become a relevant tool, because what is then the alternative? My fear is that it is a patchwork of 27 national regimes. I know that there are ministers in our member states who, if they do not have a strong ETS, start to think about what could we then do? If we have to finance the Energiewende in Germany, and Finance Minister Schäuble, he needs some revenues, how will he find it? If not through the ETS, he probably finds it in another way. The British have already introduced a floor price. Others are considering introducing national CO2 prices. So what is at stake here is, should we have a Europeanized system, or should we have renationalization of our energy and climate policies? The last thing I will mention is, very, very briefly, of course we can do a lot also through regulation. I mean, targets is one thing, pricing is another thing, but regulation for cars, for trucks, for vans, for products, for machinery, there are many things we can do, building standards, so on and so forth. But of course, only to a certain level if we do not want to have too detailed regulation at the EU level, but that is still part of the tools that we have in the toolbox. I would only mention briefly 2 further things. What we are now doing with the EU budget is to say that at least 20% of the whole EU budget should help us achieve our climate and energy targets, the 2020 targets. Obviously, it does not mean that the money will go into, say, my services in Brussels, but it means that when we take a choice in Europe for innovation, for research, for agriculture, for transport, for buildings, then the money should be spent in a way that does not work against our climate and energy targets, but that backs our climate and energy targets. I think that's a smart way of spending the money, and that's a way in a time where you do not have a lot of money that you can get the maximum value out of each euro spent at the European level. My last and final point is something I have also been asked to address. I will do that very briefly. We can come back to it. I know that there might be some, I don't know in this room, but I'm sure in your parliaments, who would say, it's all very fine. But now we have a crisis. And why bother to think about 2030 right now? Shouldn't we wait until we have had the International Climate Conference in 2015 and then see where we are? There I just have to say, in order to get an outcome of that climate conference that runs parallel to what Europe wants, Europe must make up its mind. We must have a position. We cannot come empty-handed to that negotiation. And the first question we will be met with would be, what do you suggest you are ready to do after 2020? So that is why the timing of this 2030 paper, that is no coincidence. That is in order for us in Europe to get our act together, in order to be able to speak with one voice, and thus being able to get the maximum out of the climate conference in 2015, where first the Poles this year and then the French in 2015 will be hosting and responsible for the international negotiations. So I think it is very suitable that Europe would have made its own position clear, and the different papers we have sent out, that is also in order to secure that that is happening. I think we have seen before what happens when Europe cannot speak with one voice. I also think that in Durban, where we managed to speak with one voice and make the whole world accept that we should get rid of the old way of developed countries and developing countries being split, only developed countries have to do something, developing countries, including China, should only do it voluntarily. It was a major victory for Europe to get rid of that old division and say the future agreement, everybody has to be equally legally bound. And also the big emerging economies have to do their fair share. It would be a pity if we now lose the leadership we have had in bringing the world so far, and that is why we need to get our act together. And the different green papers and international consultation paper hopefully can help us to get there, and I would be looking very much to the input also from you representing national parliaments. We would need your input very much in the process on our way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'll now ask Mr. John McCarthy to address us.
Thank you, Chairman, distinguished parliamentary committee chairs, Commissioner Hedegaard, ladies and gentlemen. At the start, let me just extend best wishes to you on behalf of our Minister for the Environment, Phil Hogan, who, due to other government business this afternoon, regrets that he couldn't be here with you. So I'm afraid you have to make do with me instead. Before I turn my attention to some Irish-specific issues, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the EU and international climate agenda, just following on from what the Commissioner has had to say, and I suppose as a bridge between the two. And this is relevant to us here in Ireland, not just because we currently happen to hold the presidency of the Council of the EU, but because ultimately so much of our climate agenda domestically, and indeed in many other member states, is inevitably driven by developments at EU and international levels. This discussion today is taking place at a very active and critically important time in the development of EU climate policy, both in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of the increasingly critical area of adaptation. While for a number of years we've had, I think, a reasonably clear understanding of where our climate policies needed to get to by 2020 through the 2009 Climate and Energy Package, we repeatedly hear from major stakeholders that in investment terms, 2020 is in fact tomorrow in their time horizons, and that investment cycles need certainty over much longer periods. While obviously maintaining a very clear focus on our ambition for 2020 and the need to advance a number of important legislative files in that area, and we'll come back to those in a moment, it's timely, as the Commissioner says, that we look beyond that immediate horizon and map out the next incremental step on the EU path to a successful low-carbon future in 2050. And in parallel with all of that, it's also absolutely essential that we prepare well for the challenging international negotiations under the Durban platform, which are gathering positive momentum, as evident at the recent discussions in Bonn. The prize that we all have to remain focused on in the international process is the ambition to agree a new climate treaty at the climate conference of the parties in Paris at the end of 2015, in accordance with the agreement reached in Durban some 18 months ago, and as the Commissioner says, an agreement which all UN member countries signed up to. EU leadership in seeking to mobilise an effective global response to climate change is a priority which Ireland has consistently supported. That support extends to progressive development of the EU's own internal climate policy agenda, so that the Union, in addition to pursuing its own transition to a competitive low-carbon economy, can also demonstrate its commitment to effective global action through leading by example on the international stage. As a member state, and most particularly in the current climate in our EU presidency role, Ireland welcomes and supports the recent initiatives by the Commission in publishing both the consultative communication on the international climate process and the Green Paper on the 2030 EU Climate and Energy Framework. And we liaised closely with Commissioner Hedegaard's team in DG Climate Action for many months in trying to synchronise the completion of their work on both documents and the scheduling of our informal Council of Environment Ministers in order to ensure that we could kick off at a very early stage the important political debate on two very politically important proposals. And this close engagement worked well. Both proposals were published in late March, and the informal council discussions took place here inside the walls of this historic castle just a few weeks later on the 23rd of April. And somewhat akin to the formation in which you yourselves are meeting here today, we arranged for the informal Council of Environment Ministers and the informal Council of Energy Ministers to come together and have a bridging meeting involving both councils at which the 2030 Green Paper was discussed. This provided an important and perhaps all too rare opportunity for both sets of ministers to sit down together and to exchange views on cross-cutting issues of core concern to both sets of ministers. In summary, the informal council discussions saw ministers generally welcoming both documents as timely and well-focused, and also welcomed the comprehensive process of consultation which the publication of the documents has initiated and to which the Commissioner has referred. In the case of the Green Paper, the political importance of providing clarity and certainty on a 2030 climate and energy policy framework was very clear, in the interests of investment, economic competitiveness and growth, and EU leadership in the international climate negotiations under the UN Convention. And it's important that all of those dimensions are recognised as key drivers in this process. And in the case of the consultative communication on the international negotiations, the Council, recognising the need to close the gap which remains to the 2 degrees Celsius target, highlighted the importance of EU leadership, but also underscored the need to move away from, as the Commissioner has said, this sort of developed and developing country firewall of the past, and secure an agreement under which all economies commit to take action according to their current and their future capabilities. So a dynamic agreement is what's required. And just to echo some of the words that the Commissioner relayed to you in relation to the extent to which parties in other parts of the world are moving forward, and China is a very good example. Our own Minister visited China last autumn in advance of our presidency, and it was very, very clear to him there that the Chinese government is very much in the space of recognising the opportunity side of the climate debate. The green economy, where are the emerging technologies? Where does investment need to be targeted? Where are the jobs and growth agendas of tomorrow coming from? So I think that is something that we in Europe need to be very careful of, and need not to lull ourselves into some sort of false sense of security that in some way other parts of the world are following Europe and following only because the reality is that many other parts of the world are actually moving ahead of Europe, and if Europe is not careful, it's going to find itself falling quickly behind. While the 2030 Green Paper and the international communication are both essential in the EU's strategic planning of its future climate agenda, it's vital that we don't lose sight of the here and now and the need to advance some critically important pieces of legislation that will provide the impetus for real emissions reductions in the short to medium term. The Commissioner has already spoken in relation to the backloading proposal and the events of the last number of weeks in which the Parliament plenary has referred it back to the Environment Committee. But apart from backloading, there are other files in which the Irish Presidency has been putting a lot of time and energy into in relation to CO2 emissions from cars, CO2 emissions from vans, both of which we are aiming to bring to first reading agreement by the time our Presidency concludes at the end of next month. And we've also made considerable progress on new legislation in relation to reducing fluorinated gases, an important group of gases that we need to deal with because of their significant global warming potential. And that's a file that we'll be in a position to pass on in a fairly advanced state to our Lithuanian colleagues, who I see are here in numbers with us today, to conclude during their presidency in the second half of the year, and the presidency, of course, with which we wish them great luck. Earlier, the critical importance of the adaptation side of the climate agenda. And sometimes, I suppose, adaptation has been seen as the poor relation in the climate debate. But the reality is that even with very substantial progress on mitigation, the adverse impacts of the changing climate are already increasingly evident to us all. And adapting to these changes is one of the most fundamental challenges for our future development and requires very careful planning. While much of that planning needs to take place at the national and local level, there are adaptation challenges that obviously do not respect national boundaries, and there is an important role, therefore, for regional approaches. And that's why the EU Climate Adaptation Strategy published by the Commission last month is such an important piece of Europe's climate adaptation architecture, and one that has the potential to stimulate growth and jobs and prevent potentially high human, economic and environmental costs arising at a later stage. By better planning now, we have a better opportunity now to secure better outcomes at lower cost over the longer term. As Presidency, we recognise the importance of the strategy, and we are therefore aiming to have conclusions adopted on it at next month's Environment Council. Earlier I mentioned that we were having this discussion at a very active and important time in the development of EU climate policy, both internally and in terms of the EU's engagement with the global negotiations process. But of course, action at the national level is also vital, and here in Ireland we are currently immersed in an equally active and important programme for the development of national climate policy and legislation. The government objective is to complete this programme by the end of this year and to adopt a final national policy position on transition to a low-carbon future, including appropriate institutional arrangements, as well as finalising the introduction of primary legislation in relation to climate. A major challenge for us here in Ireland is the fact that within the EU, we have a somewhat unusual greenhouse gas emissions profile due to a number of factors, including the high share of our emissions which are agriculture related. And let me be clear, this is not because we have a carbon intensive agriculture sector. Quite the contrary, in fact. We have a very carbon efficient agriculture and food sector, as evidenced by much research undertaken at European and other levels by the Joint Research Centre. This is simply due to the scale of our agriculture industry in our overall economy. And the significance of the agriculture and food sectors in Ireland brings a sharp focus to the parallel international priorities of climate protection and sustainable food production in a world with a projected population of 9 billion people by 2050. Ireland is on course to meet its emissions reduction target for the purposes of the Kyoto Protocol in the commitment period which ended at the end of last year. And a number of policy initiatives have helped us along that road, including the restructuring of vehicle taxation on the basis of carbon dioxide emissions, an initiative which literally turned on its head within the space of 5 years, the profile of new car purchases in Ireland, and also the introduction of a carbon tax, one that's being progressively rolled out and that just at the start of this month has been further extended to the use of solid fuel for domestic purposes. While we've done all these things, we are acutely conscious of the need to ensure that our efforts to return to stronger economic growth, we ensure in that process that we embed rigorous sustainability requirements in economic and environmental terms. We know that if we get our growth strategy wrong, we run the very real and very significant risk, as the Commission has repeatedly pointed out, of locking ourselves in to an environmentally unsustainable future that will undermine our credibility on environmental grounds and our competitive position in the medium and longer term. So our competitive future is crucially dependent on the extent to which we get our environmental policy and our sustainability policies absolutely right. The deep cuts in emissions that we will be required to implement and deliver in the period to 2050 do represent a huge challenge for Ireland, but early and effective transition to a low-carbon path holds out the prospect of a real opportunity to demonstrate environmental credibility and achieve competitive advantage in the emerging global green economy. In anticipation of the outcome of the national policy development process at the end of this year, Government has already announced a high level of mitigation ambition for 2050, and work is now underway on low-carbon roadmaps in 4 key sectors of the economy: energy, buildings, transport and agriculture. The objective is to achieve near zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 in the case of energy, buildings and transport, and carbon neutrality in the case of agriculture. It's expected that these sectoral roadmaps will be completed this year, and they will then feed into an overall national composite 2050 low-carbon roadmap to be finalised in 2014. At this stage in the policy development programme, the outline provisions of a climate action and low-carbon development bill, together with the underlying policy analysis, have been referred by the Government to the relevant parliamentary committee, which is chaired by Deputy McCarthy, for their consideration. Minister Hogan has made it clear on many occasions that he sees a central role for the parliamentary committee in the policy and legislation development process, particularly on the critical issue of how to meet Ireland's binding EU and wider international commitments, as well as pursuing our objectives towards a low-carbon economy. So in the same way as the Commissioner has been highlighting the importance of national parliamentary committees feeding into the EU policy development and the EU's approach to the international climate negotiations, in Ireland we certainly see the National Parliament Committee on Environment, chaired by Deputy McCarthy, as having a crucial role in the policy and legislative development position here on the domestic stage. In overall terms, one of Minister Hogan's priorities is to position Ireland in the vanguard of climate progressive countries, not just in the EU but at a wider international level. This reflects our support for EU proactivity and leadership in the international process. Our ongoing efforts under the National Programme for the Development of Climate Policy and Legislation, including the input which the Government will receive from the Parliamentary Committee later this year, is critical to achieving that aim. And we also believe that the priority which we have attached to climate issues during our presidency will help drive further significant progress on the EU's ambitious mitigation and adaptation agendas, while also positioning the EU to maintain its leadership role in the international climate process, a process which is so critical if we are to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and avert dangerous climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. I will now call on Dr. Brian Motherway to address us.
Thanks, Chair. I've been asked to speak to for a few minutes on one particular aspect of action towards climate change, which many member states are involved in and is also an active sector here in Ireland, and that's energy efficiency in homes. And I think it's a nice choice for the conference to have selected today, because it's something where early action is not only possible, but is actually happening out on the ground. And in many countries, we're seeing the benefits that can accrue, both in terms of emissions reduction, but also job creation and cost savings. Let me start with the truth. The cheapest source of carbon abatement in our economies is energy efficiency. In fact, in many cases, the financial benefits from undertaking energy efficiency actions far outweigh the initial costs of doing it in the first place. And while you do that, you reduce homeowners' costs of keeping their homes warm, you reduce costs for business, you create jobs in the work, you protect jobs in the increased competitiveness of the firms involved, and you bring a whole wide range of social and health benefits. It's particularly important in an economy such as Ireland, and indeed the EU as a whole, where we import so much of our energy. In Ireland, we import more than 90% of all the energy we use. So when we undertake investment in energy efficiency, the equation is quite simply taking money that we used to send out of the economy to buy oil and gas and coal and keeping it in the local economy, spending it on labour and technology instead. So let me talk about our progress on energy efficiency in homes in particular. And let me say that I'm going to concentrate on what we call retrofit of homes. So obviously, as you know, the solution to making homes more energy efficient divides between homes that are yet to be built and homes that are already built. In homes that are yet to be built, let me say the solution is relatively easy. You can raise building standards, you can ensure that all new buildings of any kind that are built to much better standards of insulation, heating control, passive solar gain, all of the technologies that are now quite mature and not at all expensive. Here in Ireland, we have upgraded our building regulations for the building of homes twice in the last decade, so that a home built now, today in 2013, will emit less than a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions of an average home in the Irish building stock. And it will do that at effectively no additional building cost, and therefore solves the problem quite neatly, compared to then leaving us with the problem about how do we deal with all the homes that we built, unfortunately, to poorer standards of energy efficiency over many decades. And that's where we focus on the concept of retrofit, which is going back into homes that will be with us for many years hence, but we want to raise our standards of energy efficiency either through installation, new heating systems, better heating controls, and all the range of solutions that are possible. This is an active sector here in Ireland. In the past 4 years, we have been giving out government grants into this sector that my organisation administers on behalf of government. We have given out about 300 million euros of government funding. That has been matched by additional private sector funding, principally among the homeowners, of 500 million euros, meaning the total investment has been about 800 million euros in making homes more energy efficient. That means about 250,000 homes have been upgraded in some shape or form, better insulation, new windows, new heating systems, whatever it is. That's out of a total housing stock of about 1.6 million, so it's about 15% of all homes have been touched by energy retrofit in the past 4 years, making it a very active sector. In that process, on average, every year, about 4,500 full-time jobs have been created from actually physically doing the work, going up into attics, insulating walls, installing new windows, which is, of course, one of the reasons why government has targeted this sector. It's also protected a lot of jobs in the industries. Even though my focus is on homes, I just mentioned we work a lot with businesses, be it hotels, hospitals, schools, factories. They're all working to save energy as well. And between them, we have worked with employers employing more than 250,000 people, all of whom have significantly reduced their energy costs, hence making all of those jobs just that little bit more sustainable than they were before those actions were taken. So, what have we learned? First of all, retrofit is technically proven, I think, at this stage. We know the kind of technologies you can install in the home, from really low-tech stuff like layers of insulation in the roof or extra layers of insulation on a wall, to more high-tech solutions like advanced control systems where you can control the heat in every room of the house to a different time and temperature. All of that is now well proven. There are a lot of good products on the market. There are a lot of intelligent, high-quality service providers doing good work. We know that it can work, and we know that the savings are there to be captured. We've also learned a lot, having done 15% of homes in the country, about how consumers make their decisions. First of all, I think there is a cohort of what I would call early adopters. There's a number of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who are maybe willing to move first and say, I would like to upgrade my home, and I would like to do that maybe before my neighbours and friends and colleagues have done it. We often ask them, why have they done that? And you get different reasons. Probably the primary driver is comfort and well-being. I want my home to be warmer, cozier. I want it to be a nicer environment for my family. I want to make the neighbours just a little bit envious of me, maybe, in terms of having a better quality home. We find that environment is not that strong a driver. Very few people are willing to spend thousands of euros in their homes purely for environmental reasons. They need to see it as part of the wider set of benefits. And in the middle is the economics, because people understand they can dramatically lower their energy bills by investing in this kind of intervention in your home. If I spend a number of thousands of euros in my home, I can reduce my energy bills by several hundred euros per year, and over maybe a 10-year period, I've actually made a profit. And I have got a better home, my bills are lowered, and I've made a positive economic equation of that. However, most people don't think like that. Maybe some of us in the business do, and maybe some economists and analysts and statisticians do, but most people don't tend to look at a 10-year investment horizon in their home and say, okay, that's got a positive net present value, I'm willing to invest in that. So factors like comfort and well-being, asset value in the home are very important in trying to encourage people to undertake these retrofits. And that becomes critically important now that we've done the first 15%, who in many ways are the more willing and hence the easier people to reach. We now need to move on to the vast majority of people who haven't chosen yet to retrofit their homes and understand how we can both persuade those people to do it and enable to do them once they're willing to do so. So I call that moving from niche to normal, where we've done the early movers, the enthusiastic people, the first 15%. How do we make it normal that all existing buildings are retrofitted to a suitable standard so we can really get the carbon out of that sector, as well as bringing the economic and social benefits that come with that? And the solution to that is a healthy market. There is a role for government here. We have driven this sector by government grants up to now. That can't go on indefinitely. The taxpayer can't take on the burden of supporting every retrofit in Ireland or indeed in Europe, and therefore it becomes about effectively what an economist would call fixing market failure. Because if this makes sense, if this makes economic and environmental sense, why are so few people doing it compared to the potential audience out there? The solution on the one hand lies in a supply side that is offering a range of solutions, so that if I'm thinking of getting this done in my home, I can choose from different people coming to me and saying I have different solutions. I trust them. I know they will do good quality work. I know the kind of technologies they're talking about have been proven, that I'm not some kind of guinea pig, or that I'm not going to be fleeced or cheated in some way. And then commensurately on the demand side, you need householders that are motivated to act and enabled to act. And they're quite different things. And I spoke a minute ago about some of the motivating factors, be it comfort, environment, or economics. But even once people are enthusiastic about it, then you have to say, well, are we making it possible for them to act? So do they know where to go for information? Do they know who to trust in the market in terms of quality and legitimacy of their offerings? And of course, crucially, can they afford it? Because energy efficiency may well be a fine equation for me to say, if you spend 10,000 euros now, you'll save 15,000 euros over its lifetime. You still got to have the 10,000 euros. And that's a key limiting factor. So can we develop loan models or energy service, what they sometimes call pay-as-you-save models, where actually the savings over the lifetime pay back the initial investment? So we need to find solutions for people who are willing to invest in energy efficiency, but maybe don't have either the savings or the ability to borrow the money themselves. And that is a key element in all parts of energy efficiency. We know it makes sense when you look at it over the lifetime, but it's all about pay now and save later, and that's a key question for all of this sector. So our focus now, as we move from what I would call phase one, from the niche market, the 15%, to try and get the rest of society involved, first of all, is to remind people that we have now proven on the ground that this works. So I can quote the statistics, but also so many people have done this now in Ireland that everybody knows a neighbour or a friend or a family member. So there's a level of awareness and confidence and goodwill towards this sector that wasn't there even just 4 or 5 years ago. And that's what we have to build on now as we move to the next phase. The role for government is to capture this opportunity in terms of emissions reduction and economic well-being in the country in a way that actually drives activity. So we move from theory to practice. We know efficiency works. How do we actually make it happen on the ground? There are a number of dimensions which I've touched on, which include raising awareness so we get people interested and willing, making sure that the services they are being offered and the solutions are being offered are quality and they can have confidence in them, and of course the key element of how is this going to be financed. The last point I'd like to make is I think there's a key role for the public sector to lead. Since this is all about building momentum and therefore building credibility, no better actor than the public sector itself to move early. In Ireland, our public sector spends about €600 million every year on energy. Again, like any other sector, most of that is imported fossil fuels from other countries. We have set an accelerated target for public sector buildings between now and 2020 to actually surpass the national efficiency target by 50%. If we achieve that, not only have we proved and driven activity in a sector so that there's business out there, so that solutions are being developed, but also we've permanently reduced the government's and hence the taxpayers' spend on energy by €200 million every year. So it makes it a much easier equation for government to get involved in, and that's where we're concentrating lots of our efforts. So that's what I wanted to tell you, the story of energy efficiency in Ireland. I think many other countries have similar stories to tell, and certainly it's part of Irish policy to keep a focus on a dimension of climate action that not just sees major emissions reductions in the future, but brings economic and jobs benefits in the here and now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brian. Now, again, we're very caught for time, so I would ask people who are asking questions to stick as briefly as you can to the question. Otherwise, we'll go over time and other speakers won't get a chance to come in. So if you can keep your question to its absolute minimum in terms of time. Now, I have a number of speakers who have indicated, and I'm going to do them in 2 batches of 6. And the first is from the Netherlands, Mr. Janssen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to address my question to Mrs. Hedegaard. You underlined the importance of proper pricing of the cost of pollution, and we agree the price of carbon emission is not proper at the moment. But I think that backloading is only a small part of the solution. There's interaction between 2 of the 2020 climate targets of the Union. We want to reduce the carbon emissions of industry and the large power plants with 20%. And at the other hand, we want to raise the market share of renewables by 20% to 20%. But the increase of the market share of renewables lowers the electricity production by the fossil-fueled power plants and causes price pressure on the carbon market. And so shouldn't we adjust the carbon cap automatically for the growing market share of renewables to avoid windfall profits and frustration of the carbon market? Thank you.
Thank you. Our next questioner is from Greece, Mr. Dimas.
In the last decade, the EU has achieved to become a leader, driving the process for an effective global reaction against climate change. In fact, as climate change is a global issue, only a coordinated global reaction can deal effectively with the issue. I am saying all this because I want to stress on the fact that if the EU wants to maintain or even strengthen its credibility in global leadership, it has to ensure that it will meet its 2020 goals. At the same time, as the Commissioner underlined, it has the obligation to organize its actions for 2030 as soon as possible. My question is very specific. What initiatives has the Commission taken or will be taking in the near future in order to work more closely with international organizations and other countries, among which I include the US and China, in order to achieve the best possible global solution for climate change?
Thank you. And our next questioner is from France, Mr. Courtieu.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame.
Thank you, Chairman. Mrs. Hedegaard has partly answered my question. The European Parliament have been working on CO2 emissions, and that the European Parliament rejected the Commission's proposal in 2013. So first question, as from now, what possible margins for negotiation is there between the Commission, the Parliament and the Member States? Secondly, the market mechanisms produce CO2 price fluctuation, and they're so volatile that that is a problem in terms of investment. Then, what is the most effective mechanism for the longer term if you want to really reduce emissions? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cortiu. Our next speaker is Ms. Moldovan from Romania.
Thank you very much. Great speeches, useful debate. I'm right here. I hope I'm not rude if I'm telling you that I don't have any question, but allow me to give you some information about our politics and measures in our country. I think I need 2 minutes, maybe 2 minutes and a half, if it's possible.
Can you just please keep it to a minimum? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We must all recognize that politics and measures to reduce greenhouse gases imply important economic costs and changing many aspects of existing systems of production and consumption. However, internationally, there are a number of reservations on the adoption of concrete reduction targets. If economic analyses performed before the current economic crisis showed increased costs regarding reduction goals, updating these to the new conditions generated by the crisis is estimated to cost around 1% of GDP until 2050. So, considering the importance of decision 406 from 2009 to reducing greenhouse gases emissions at European and national level, Romania shall ensure compliance with all technical and institutional aspects related to the implementation of this decision in our country. I would like to tell you more than this, because we identify 30 seconds. Okay, thank you. Because I really want to know you what my country has done in this field. That's why I don't have any question, because we are moving. We identified economic sectors that require specific measures to reduce greenhouse gases emissions.
Okay, I'm going to have to call you. I'm going to have to ask you to finish, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is from Portugal, Ramos Pietro.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much for the Commissioner representation and for the other colleagues on the floor. I agree with you, science of climate change is no more in dispute, I hope. Tackling climate change is not a choice, but I think is an imperative for the European community. As you know, in Portugal, a round of the electricity produced in our country comes from renewable energy. We have, I think, a good national plan for energy efficiency. But as in this morning was said, and today also in the evening, investing in insulation and in the changing of windows, these measures are very expensive, as all the people here knows. So with the budget crisis and the incentives that we have to solar and to wind must be cut. And if we cut these incentives, retroactivity, this destroyed the confidence in the future in this kind of investment. And I don't agree with one thing that was said in this morning, that maybe in the future we have to have two kinds of policies, environment policy in Europe. maybe one policy with pragmatic targets that everybody can support, and one policy with ideal targets that only some of us can support. I don't agree with this. I think we have to maintain, to stick to the plan. I agree with your position that you express here. And I want to say, Chair, only one thing more. I agree with you that our competitors are moving. 2 months ago, I remember that Shenzhen Special Zone approved the first climate change law in China. And in a meeting in 18th of April with some colleagues of European colleagues in Beijing, the minister told us that in 1 year, China will have a climate change law.
Thank you, Ms. Pieta. And our final speaker of this batch is from Spain, Mr. Ruiz Maria.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the European Commission on a point. Now, if we achieve those 3 objectives and targets that have been mentioned, I'd like to talk about forest fires. They're a major natural catastrophe, and we have a huge impact from that. Now, in recent years, across Europe, we've seen periods where there's been wide-ranging forest fires. Now, obviously, there is a link with climate change as well, and there's an economic impact. But huge resources are destroyed, not just biodiversity. We're talking about rural environment and an economic impact. Now, on policy for forest fires and for sustainable management, I think this is something which has to be taken into account in climate change policy, because forests are a natural resource and obviously account for thousands of jobs as well. And I think this is an important issue for across the entire Union. So what I would like to say to the Commission, I would urge them to promote a specific policy at EU level on prevention of forest fires, and that funds be made available. For example, funds that are currently used for rural development. I think some of those should be assigned to this area, particularly in the south of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to go to the panel, and I'm going to ask the panel to respond in the order in which they spoke. And I'm going to ask Commissioner Hedegaard to lead, please.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief, but there were many questions. To the last point, I agree very much with what you were saying about rural development. That's what we are trying to do with the mainstreaming of things like this in the overall EU budget, but as you know, also through the agricultural policies, and when we talk about the Pillar 2, we also try there to make it more climate mainstreamed so that farmers can use it or foresters can use it also for adaptation purposes. And by the way, last month we presented an adaptation strategy from EU, and we also have had the land use and land use change rules now set, so that should also help to have sustainable forestry, because now we have joint rules for this. So there are many things, but I take your point very much. I was in Spain recently. I know that your environment minister, he is updated every hour on how many forest fires are there today. So it's a huge issue. To Paulus Janssen from the Netherlands, I agree. The backloading is only a small thing, as you said. I think it should be a no-brainer. If you have a market that is already overflooded, you stop the overflooding. But it doesn't solve all the issues. The next, and as you point to, more substantial issues, that would be the structural options. The Commission already back in November presented 6 structural options, saying we could do A, B, C, D, E, F, and we are now waiting for the input from all the stakeholders, including, of course, the member states and the national parliaments, how best to do that. One of the things we would try to do better, I would say, for the 2030 package than for 2020. I was not there as a commissioner in 2020, but my impression is it was 20, 20, 20. It sounded very nice, easy to remember. 20%, 20%, 20% in 20. We can, of course, not do the same for 30, 30, 30 for 30. We have now to find out what is, and that was what you were pointing to, what is the most cost-efficient interaction between what we do in the field of renewables, in the field of efficiency, and with CO2 reduction. We have analyzed in the Commission the cost-efficient trajectory to where we need to be at the middle of this century CO2-wise. That goes via a 40% CO2 reduction target for 2030. But that does not necessarily mean that the efficiency target or the renewables target should also be 40%. What is the best possible interaction? What is the best energy mix? That is the kind of thing we are analyzing right now. Mr. Dimas from Greece mentioned that Europe, in order to keep our credibility, must really deliver what we have pledged. That is very true. And you ask specifically, how are we working with, for instance, the US and China? As this gentleman was mentioning with Shenzhen, for instance, recently, adopting their emissions trading scheme. Shanghai is doing it. Very soon we will have a nationwide law for this, also for emissions trading in China. That's just one example. We have been working with the Chinese authorities. How could they introduce a market-based system in pricing CO2 pollution in China? It's not a small thing, it's a very substantial thing. So you could say we are working with our counterparts on very tangible, specific things. But then, of course, we are also working with the Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, in the context of Major Economies Forum, for instance, trying to work with them, what is the way forward in the international framework. We are right now exploring whether we could have cooperation on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies globally. Every time we are spending €1 subsidizing renewables worldwide, we are spending 7 times as much, some would argue even more, but at least 7 times as much subsidizing fossil fuels. How wise a strategy is that? How do we get rid of that? We have an invitation to a lot of partners working together with them to see if we could work together on HFC gases. That is another very tangible, specific thing. So we are trying, I could mention others, renewables, access to sustainable energy for all, working very much with Africa and least developed countries. So we are trying to identify relevant partners for relevant pieces of cooperation so that we are not just sitting like this waiting for an international agreement to pop up. We are trying to impact that, to influence that, and while we are doing that, work very specifically with key partners on concrete policy areas. Monsieur Coteau from France said, what now about with the backloading? What is a margin to negotiate with member states and European Parliament? I would say there is not that much. We have already said very clearly to the European Parliament, of course we do not take it lightly in the Commission that we have to do this backloading. It's not something we would do every fortnight or every month. It is something we do once because we have an extraordinary situation, an economic crisis of historic dimensions. Which other policy areas do we have where after the crisis we say, oh, we don't do anything? We just see what is happening to this market-based system. It doesn't exist. In all sorts of areas, we have been addressing the consequences of the crisis. That's what we're doing here. But I would say, right now, the pressure must be very much on the European Parliament. They sent it back to their Environment Committee. Actually, it was proposed in the very same vote where they had a majority for rejecting our backloading proposal. It was proposed right away to have a vote saying that they would never want to see this proposal again. That vote did not get a majority, and therefore it was sent back. So now the committee will have to come up with how do they see the way forward. And then the very big job is with our Irish friends, and maybe even soon our Lithuanian friends. What about Council? Because we have a few member states who have not made up their mind yet. Spain, Portugal, Germany. And we have this situation in Germany where even Chancellor Merkel last Monday at an international conference, spoke out in favor of backloading. Her finance minister is speaking in favor of it. Her environment minister signs up to all sorts of letters. That because of their coalition partner who does not want it, the small FDP, they cannot take a decision anytime soon. But I just wanted to flag here that that is not the situation as far as I understand it in Spain and in Portugal, and there I understand the governments still have to make up their mind. So that could change the whole game if those countries would come on board. To Mrs. Moldovan from Romania, just to say thank you for what you told us. I have a very good cooperation with our Romanian government, and to Portugal, I agree very much with what you said, and you said keep the incentives not only for the ETS with the price, but also the positive incentive. And there I would end just with adding one piece of information. I do not know if you have heard it earlier today, but in parallel with us in the Commission working on the 2000